Hello, puppies and kittens. I've often said that every logical fallacy has been used as an argument for God, and that every argument for God is a logical fallacy. That even includes the biggest ones, the ones most often cited or respected by theologians. In fact, some of these arguments are a compilation of a few different fallacies at once, and the Kalam cosmological argument is no exception. I've seen a number of other skeptics tearing this one apart to the point that I think that it's pretty well done, but I still think I should add my own commentary or criticism to it too. Premise 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, we could say that whatever exists has a cause, but then that would mean that God has a cause, and believers can't have that. A religious apologist named William Lane Craig invented this argument in an attempt to rationalize his God. And believers want their God to be older and bigger and badder than everything in every direction they can exaggerate. So he has to be eternal, even though that presents significant problems for their own arguments later on. Because these same people also argue that infinity is impossible. Premise 1 depends on the possibility of infinity. Because if infinity is impossible, then God is impossible, or God is not infinite. You can't say that the God of Abraham is only qualitatively infinite, because his interactions with Abraham after Adam and before Moses reveal that he must be quantitative too. Especially when you read Hosea and realize that it was actually written centuries earlier than these other works, that Hosea might actually be the oldest book of the Bible, and God is depicted very differently there. So, of course, believers argue that infinity is impossible for all things except God, because reasons, also known as special pleading, a logical fallacy. So they arbitrarily phrase it as whatever begins to exist. That really doesn't work either, because William Lane Craig based his first premise on the notion of presentism, a metaphysically contested position wherein only the present exists. This is vital for Craig's argument, because under eternalism, the universe would not begin to exist. There's philosophical opposition to this idea, so Craig altered it such that only the present exists, but the present can also be divided into past present and future present, which presents another contradiction. Premise 2. Universe began to exist. Now, the classic notion was that the universe is eternal, that it has always existed. It didn't begin to exist until Big Bang cosmologists suggested a century or so ago that maybe it did begin to exist. The creationists delight in saying that scientists have proven that the universe had a beginning, and they use that argument against the Big Bang, which is funny because the discovery of the Big Bang was the evidence that the universe had a beginning. So physicists don't hold to that so much anymore. As I understand it, even in models of cosmogony that have a singularity, according to classical relativity, that singularity is itself regarded as eternal, or the material energy within it is apparently eternal, meaning that it was never created. Thus, the universe was never created, and consequently, there is no creator. Cosmic inflation had a beginning, but the universe itself apparently did not. Now, this is not my field, none of it. I struggle to understand any of it, so I prefer to refer to experts. Astrophysicist Sean Carroll said that the universe is quantum mechanical, and the fact that there is singularity in classical general relativity and the Big Bang doesn't mean that there's a beginning of the universe. It means that classical general relativity is breaking down. It's no longer applicable, and we should be quantum mechanical. But he adds that we don't know enough about quantum gravity to say whether the universe had a beginning or not. We don't know if the universe was ever contracting or not. All we can say is our classical theories break down, and if you're honest, that's really all you can say. If you're driven by some other set of reasons to conclude that there was a beginning to the universe, you're not being honest. End quote. Now, if the universe was created, which also resulted in the beginning of time, then how could there have been an event before time began that could have caused the universe? So let's add that fact to the premises of this argument. Everything that has a cause has a prior moment in time. If there wasn't a prior moment in time, then there can't have been a cause. There's another contradiction, too, when religious apologists say that the singularity proves a finite past. Singularity itself is made of infinities. The believers ignore that, saying that an infinite past is incoherent, yet they also call for an infinite future. Islam, for example, promises eternal life, not a spiritual life in a supernatural realm, but a physical life where we spend eternity right here on earth in reanimated, reconstituted bodies that still have to eat and drink and defecate and urinate, even though we're supposed to exist that way for all of eternity. If infinity is impossible, then eternal life is impossible. Thus, Islam must be false. I've seen philosophers and physicists both argue reasons why there can't be a future eternity from a finite past, and I'll include a link to that below because it's a brilliant presentation. So how could the universe be eternal? Well, suggested options include a Big Bang, Big Crunch sort of oscillation with a past infinite universe compressing into a singularity, followed by a sort of bounce back in which the arrow of time progresses toward entropy, where previously it may have pointed the other way. And this would be like a cosmic pulsation. That's just one example. Some models of cosmogony, like the Hartel-Hawking model or Sean Carroll's quantum eternity theorem, are interpreted as having no beginning, being eternal in both directions. The point is that in a syllogism, if all the premises are necessarily correct and the conclusion is necessarily indicated by those premises, then the conclusion should also be correct. Both of these premises fail because they ain't necessarily so. Yet from these two premises, believers are expected to conclude that the universe had a cause. And there's a problem even with that, because Professor Alistair Willison explained in the many worlds model, in quantum mechanics, causality is an emergent process within each individual world, but not outside or between them. That causation arises and is contained within each world and is not fundamental to them. Sean Carroll notes that the word cause doesn't appear in any of the papers on fundamental physics and quantum cosmology that are cited by religious apologists. Philosophy professor Barry Lower says that every event is preceded by other events, what we would call causes of a further event, even though causation is not fundamental in physics. But he says that none of this gives any reason to believe that the universe itself had a cause. Actually, the Kalam cosmological argument fails yet again in that it has two conclusions, one of which, the big one, is only a non sequitur that is not implied by either premise, because we're supposed to assume a particular cause, one that is the product of unwarranted assumptions. Wanna pretenders, defenders of the faith, want the cause of the universe to be their God. Thus, they insist that the description of the cosmic cause must match the description of what they imagine their God to be. So they say that the cause must be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Not necessarily. That wouldn't be true of Vilenkin's notion of quantum tunneling, which is effectively the same result as we would get from a multiverse situation, wherein universes pop in and out of existence just like quantum fluctuations for all eternity, both spatially and temporally, seemingly out of nothing. I liken it to watching bubbles appearing in the bottom of a saucepan coming to boil. Those bubbles don't come from nothing. They just look like it. So we're not talking about everything coming from nothing. We're not talking about nothing. There was never a time when there was nothing. I don't think anybody believes there was ever a time when there was absolutely nothing. So we're still talking about a physical realm governed by physical laws. I'm personally most fond of the notion of a fourth spatial dimension flooding into an inflating three-dimensional space-time. It's kind of like if you've ever seen an MRI, when it begins to scan the human body. I mean, you come starting at the head, and the head just seemingly appears out of nowhere, and it's a two-dimensional scan that every millimeter down your body gets another reading, and so it would appear as if you appeared out of nothing, and then of course disappeared in evanescence at the end. But we know that's not the case. But that's what it would look like if you had a fourth spatial dimension inflating three-dimensional space-time. We wouldn't say that any of that was spaceless, timeless, or immaterial. No, Material energy would still exist and physics would still apply, even if it might be quantum rather than classical. So believers go on to further assume, again, for no good reason at all, that the cause of the universe must be a personal agent. Why? Because the purpose of the Kalam cosmological argument is that believers can establish a false dichotomy, another fallacy, wherein they can try to define their God into existence under the guise of a logical deduction in lieu of any evidence and despite all the evidence to the contrary, simply because they allow no other options. Why? Because of the question begging fallacy that is ubiquitous throughout all religions. They simply rely on arbitrarily modified circular arguments routing back to an assumed conclusion. Because religion is biased by definition, and confirmation bias is another fallacy that is integral, fundamental to this conclusion. Now, it's important to note that there are philosophers and physicists who believe in God, but who do not believe that the universe was created the way the Kalam implies. But with that said, even if there was a beginning of the universe, which several physicists now reject, and even if there was a cause other than the hypothetical options already listed, there still is no reason to imagine that the cause of the universe must be either intelligent or personal, nor is there any indication that such is even possible. As I've said a few times before in other presentations, our ancestors once believed that thunder and lightning and volcanoes were gods in action, that comets were an omen, that the stars and planets had human characteristics, that sickness was a curse of witchcraft, and that epilepsy was demonic possession. All because that's what religion would have us believe. And in each case, the real truth might never have been discovered had we been satisfied by those lies. And in each case, the reality was a revelation of whole new fields of study previously unimagined and vastly more complex than the simple excuses we made up in ignorance from superstition. No doubt that pattern will continue, such that if we ever do discover a cause for the Big Bang or some better explanation for the origin of life, the universe, and everything, it too will be a wealth of new information with practical application, and it will be so advanced that it will render all our previous beliefs in gods and ghosts and magic to be just as laughably silly as every other field of study so far has already shown.